Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Welcome to It's Murder Up North. In the previous episodes, I covered the stories of some of the notorious names residing within the cells of Wakefield Prison, including Charles Bronson, a violent, unpredictable man who has spent 50 years behind bars despite having never taken a life. Unlike the lesser-known subject of this episode, an individual who committed his first murder when he was just 17 years old. Despite this, he would spend just 10 years behind bars before being freed to kill again. Join me as I delve into the case of Mark Robinson and the crimes that led to his incarceration in Monster Mansion. Newbury Way is a street in Billingham, North East England, situated upon a typical estate comprised mainly of terraced houses owned by the local authority. In 1979, the residents of Newbury Way would be faced with two tragedies, which occurred within a couple of months of each other. The first took place in March, when an explosion tore through one of the homes. Inside the property were Keith and Margaret Pickering and their daughter Julie Diane. As her husband sat in the living room watching television, Margaret had been upstairs with Julie when the explosion occurred. Keith, with the aid of his neighbours, desperately fought to save the pair. Despite their efforts, both 24-year-old Margaret and her 17-month-old daughter Julie would perish in the fire. The subsequent inquest concluded that their deaths were accidental, and the cause of the blaze was traced to an electrical short circuit which ruptured a gas supply pipe in an upstairs cupboard. 2 months later, the burnt-out remains of the Pickerings' home still haunted the residents of Newbury Way, with the memories of that terrible night still fresh in their minds when the sound of sirens broke through the peaceful morning of Sunday the 27th of May. With it being the Maybank holiday weekend, many of the residents had been woken by the noise, as an ambulance arrived, followed in quick succession by police cars, and before long the street was being swarmed by police vehicles and officers. Earlier that Sunday morning, 8-year-old Lee entered his living room, with the youngster being confronted with the sight of his mother lying upon the floor. Unable to rouse her, he fled from the home to a tent which had been erected on the neighbouring recreation ground, within which his 2 brothers and a friend were sleeping. Having summoned his siblings, the 3 boys, unsure what to do, raced down the street and headed to their grandmother's house for help. But 32-year-old Patricia Wagner had been deceased for a number of hours before her body had been discovered, and an examination by the attending medics quickly identified that foul play had been involved. Born on May 28, 1946, Patricia Ann Wagner, known by many as Anne, was described as an attractive blonde by the newspapers. A popular person, she was a well-known face around Billingham, as well as in the pubs and clubs of nearby Stockton and Hartlepool, where she was said to be the life and soul of the party. She was also a devoted mother of 3 boys, Dean, aged 13, Sean, aged 10, and her youngest child, Lee, aged 8. Her love life was a little bit more complicated and had raised eyebrows in the area. Patricia had divorced her husband Barry in 1978 and had remarried in June the same year to an eccentric American who was frequently seen walking around wearing a Stetson. Naturally, her ex-husband and current husband would need to be tracked down and eliminated as suspects. In the meantime, detectives arrived at the scene, with them observing the brutality of the injuries Patricia had suffered, particularly to her face, with clear signs there had been a struggle, yet no evidence that a sexual assault had occurred. Robbery was also ruled out as a motive, as nothing appeared to be missing, with items of value still present about the property. Yet they did find that the back door was unlocked and a window was open, providing potential entry points for the assailant, although investigators couldn't discount the possibility that Patricia had let her attacker in through the front door. Unable to narrow down a motive or the killer's means of entering or exiting the home, police turned to questioning the family and neighbours, attempting to garner a better idea of Patricia's life and her last known movements. In doing so, they spoke to her mother, Mary Johnson, who had required sedation upon hearing about her daughter's death. However, when police were able to speak to her later that day, it allowed them to exclude both Patricia's ex and current husband as suspects, with the former working in Africa, while Glenn Wagner, her American husband, was still in the States, where he worked as an oilman. He and Patricia had spent the last 5 months with his family in Lamont, Wyoming, and she had only returned from the trip the day before the murder, with Glenn planning to follow a couple of weeks later upon completion of a business trip to the Persian Gulf. During their separation, the pair planned to keep in contact via phone, with it being determined that Patricia had made a transatlantic call to her husband from her mother's house on Saturday night, with the 32-year-old bidding him good night and heading home around about 11:30. The lead investigator assigned to the case, Chief Superintendent Norman Hudson, will later tell the press, "She had been out and about with family and friends since returning to England. We know her movements on Saturday, but we don't know anything about what she did after leaving her mother's house at 11:30 p.m. on Saturday." They theorized that Patricia had made the short trip across the street from her mother's home and entered her own property, which, as far as anyone was aware, had been empty, with one of her children staying at his grandmother's for the night, while the older two were sleeping in a tent just yards away from the home. It was speculated that perhaps it was for their benefit that the back door had been left unlocked, in case they no longer wanted to stay in the tent. But had the house actually been empty when Patricia arrived home? Was her attacker waiting for her? Alternatively, had he entered the property later that night, either through stealth, deception, or invitation? Given her popularity in the area, it was imperative that neighbours and friends were spoken to in order to ascertain if anyone bore ill will towards Patricia. Another person they hoped may be able to shed some light on this matter was Glenn, but all efforts to contact him in America failed. But 24 hours later, on Monday the 28th of May, the unsuspecting husband called his mother-in-law, hoping to speak to Patricia and wish her a happy 33rd birthday. Instead, he was given the devastating news that with less than a fortnight before their first wedding anniversary, his beloved wife was dead. He would make the 500-mile journey to Billingham, not to celebrate her birthday or their anniversary, but to visit the morgue, where he was expected to formally identify Patricia's body. As the family struggled to comprehend the seemingly motiveless murder of their loved one, the police continued their efforts to find the perpetrator, with the post-mortem results suggesting that whoever had attacked Patricia had entered the property unarmed. The 32-year-old had suffered horrific facial injuries, with particular damage around the nose, which had been broken, the pathologist concluding that these had been caused by a fist, while the cause of death was stated as being strangulation, precipitated by the wire from a lamp in the living room, leading to the conclusion that with all other motives excluded, perhaps some sort of altercation had occurred. This was a detail Chief Superintendent Hudson would allude to when he spoke to the press, stating, "I still don't know the motive. All I can believe is that there was a quarrel." With nothing more to aid them, he appealed for help, advising that "we are anxious to trace a number of people who had been sighted getting in and out of cars in Newbury Way between the hours of 12:30 and 1:30 a.m., with these being the times they believed the attack had occurred." Continuing his appeal, Chief Superintendent Hudson added, "Certain people were also seen walking through the court in front of some of the garages beside the house between these times, whom I would very much like to trace." Having narrowed down an estimated time for the attack to have taken place, the police also identified a person they wished to speak to, who had been seen in the area at roughly 1 a.m. A number of witnesses had described a man, aged 19 or 20, with a slim 6-foot-tall frame and fair hair. He was said to be wearing light-coloured slacks and a light or white shirt with a dark jacket, with onlookers surprised that he was not wearing a coat, despite it being cold and raining. The youth had been seen walking from the vicinity of the Telstar pub, which is now called the Lion Bar and Grill. He was walking from the direction of the Telstar Public House, on Law Grange Avenue between Marsh House Avenue and Neeson Avenue, the latter being the main road from which Newbury Way can be accessed. However, the superintendent would point out that the area is also riddled with alleyways, cut-throughs and fields, all of which would have been used to access the estate with minimum risk of detection. While this individual was being sought, other information would be garnered which would change the perception of when the murder occurred. It was through the recollection of 26-year-old steelworker Alan McChrystal that this new time frame was formed. Alan had told his parents that he had, quote, been out for the night with his girlfriend and ran out of money in Middlesbrough. He had to walk home and was coming into the street at about 4:30 a.m. when he saw Anne through her living room window. She came to the window and called out to him to ask the time. As far as he could see, she was alone in the house. This information changed the estimated time of the murder from 1:30 a.m. to being closer to 4:30 a.m., with efforts redirected to find any potential witnesses who may have seen or heard anything around that time. Routine inquiries would be carried out, beginning with direct neighbours and spiralling outwards, with nothing to suggest that any of them were involved in the murder. This supposition changed when an RAF cadet was arrested. At just 17 years old, he had initially raised no alarm bells when he was spoken to during the routine door-to-door inquiries. But when he was arrested and entered the interview room, police got a glimpse of the man beneath the mask. On the 31st of May 1979, the youth would appear before the court, where he was formally charged with murder, with the full details of Mark Nigel Robinson's actions that night being revealed when he stood trial in December of 1979. During the trial at Teesside Crown Court, the prosecution laid out the order of events as described by the defendant in his confession. Mark, who had been training with the RAF since enlisting in April 1979, had returned home for the Maybank holiday weekend, with his family residing on the same street as Patricia. He had told police that on the night of the murder he had been heading home from a party, but decided to stop at his neighbour's home, alluding to what would later be described as Patricia's supposed easy virtue. He hoped to be intimate with her, but he also was wary that there may be another man in the house. He therefore feigned drunkenness as he knocked on the 32-year-old's door, with him acting as though he had accidentally ended up on her doorstep instead of his own. Despite only knowing Mark by sight, he alleged that Patricia willingly let him into the house, noting that she was dressed in her nightgown. Having gained entry, and establishing that she was alone, Mark claimed that the pair sat on the sofa and talked for a while, before Patricia excused herself and headed upstairs to the bedroom. Mark claimed that during her absence he was sick on the sofa, and had called out to apologise to Patricia, who upon her return reassured him that he was okay, after which the pair continued to talk. As the conversation progressed, the 17-year-old declared his attraction to the woman 15 years his senior, and the discussion changed to flirtation, with Patricia allegedly disclosing details about her youth and promiscuity. Mark claimed that as she spoke he became increasingly disgusted by what he was hearing, and his desire for sex had been drowned out as he grew annoyed, with him advising police that at that point he, quote, had gone off the idea of having sex with the woman. He proceeded to state that Patricia began to threaten to tell his mother about his visit, which only infuriated Mark further, with him telling the police, quote, it was her going to tell my mam I'd been with her. All I was bothered about was my mam finding out. Wanting to get away from her, Mark claimed he headed towards the door, while calling the 32-year-old a slut, a slag and a cow. When Patricia muttered something under her breath in reply, he turned back and struck her in the face with his fist. How truthful this account is we will never know, as we only have his version of events, with another possible alternative being that Patricia had threatened to tell his mother after rejecting his advances, and it was the combination of the rejection and threat which Mark responded to with violence. Mark would continue to detail what he claimed happened next, with him recalling that despite taking a punch to the face, Patricia was still standing, and had attempted to defend herself by grabbing hold of the back of Mark's head. He issued a second punch to her face, which caused her to fall to the floor. While she was down, he proceeded to kick her with his RAF-issued boots. As the red mist cleared, Mark noticed that Patricia was now unconscious, and he told police that he realised that, quote, this was attempted murder, and in a split-second decision, he opted to finish her off. Grabbing the first thing to hand, which was the wire from the table lamp, he wrapped it around Patricia's neck. Having ended Patricia Wagner's life, Mark made efforts to clean himself up, heading to the bathroom and washing the blood off his hands. He did not return to the body, leaving his victim lying upon the living room floor for her 8-year-old son to find just a couple of hours later. Not wishing to be seen, he decided not to exit through the front door, and seemingly unaware that the back door was unlocked, he climbed through the open window and headed home. When he arrived, his mother greeted him with concern, having seen his blood-stained clothing, yet her 17-year-old son, the boy who had a promising future, having just joined the RAF, lied to her, claiming he had been in a fight with a friend. On the 29th of May 1979, just 2 days after the murder, Mark was one of hundreds of individuals questioned as part of the inquiry. The teenager denied knowing anything about the murder, with his demeanour and surety not raising any suspicions with the officers. With the end of the bank holiday, and the police seemingly looking elsewhere for the killer, Mark made his way back to RAF Swinderby in Lincolnshire to continue his training, but he was followed soon afterwards by detectives, who questioned the 17-year-old once more. As before, he denied knowledge of the murder, only to be confronted with evidence found at the scene, namely a palm print and fingerprint recovered from the table lamp, which had been matched to him. This new revelation made Mark reconsider his denials, and he accepted that he was responsible for the death of Patricia Wagner. In court, he repeated this admission of guilt, with him being handed a custodial sentence. Reports state that he was observed crying as he was led from the dock, with his eyes falling upon his mother, to whom he called out, "I love you," before being taken to the cells below. When Charles Bronson was initially incarcerated for 7 years for armed robbery, his behaviour during his imprisonment led to his sentence being extended for several years. Meanwhile, Stephen Kisco, whose refusal to admit his guilt for a crime he did not commit, resulted in him being denied the right for parole. In contrast, Mark Robinson would show exemplary behaviour behind bars. He had already admitted his guilt, and in the eyes of the justice system, he had made progress by showing remorse for his actions. With his age likely also being a factor, the decision was made to release him, having served only 10 years. In March 1989, the well-built 15-stone 27-year-old became a free man once more, with him being placed on licence for life. Initially he settled down in Wakefield and got a job at Roast and Carpet Factory. Here he met 25-year-old Sharon Morley, who lived in the Portobello area of the city with her parents. The relationship developed quickly between the pair, with Mark opening up to his new girlfriend regarding his conviction, although he lied about the details, claiming that he had gotten into a drunken brawl in the street, during which the man he was fighting fell to the floor and died. He was able to convince Sharon that having been behind bars he had changed, and by February of 1989 the pair moved nearly 80 miles north of Wakefield to Robinson's hometown of Billingham, taking up residence on Bedford Terrace, just a 5-minute drive away from where Patricia Wagner was killed. As the months passed, the couple settled into the area, both getting jobs, Mark as a labourer and Sharon as a factory machinist. They also became acquainted with their neighbours, who saw them as, quote, smashing people, a great couple. And like many young couples, the pair had discussed purchasing the home they were residing in and planned to get married. Yet not all was as rosy as it seemed. Sharon was missing her family back in Wakefield, and on numerous occasions the pair had been heard having heated disagreements regarding her desire to move back there. There had also been friction brewing over some treasured possessions in the form of photographs, letters and cards Mark had received from his loved ones while in prison. He alleged that upon their move to Billingham, Sharon had forced him to destroy them, but she had refused to dispose of letters and photos from her past, which he objected to. Things would come to a head on the 16th of September 1989, when police were called to the couple's home at 8:15 that evening. Here they found Sharon Morley deceased, while Mark had a number of injuries to his arms and legs. It would be several days later before he was formally charged with Sharon's murder, but the full details of what had occurred between the pair would not come to light until the trial, held at Newcastle Crown Court in June 1990. Two versions of events would be presented to the court, with the prosecution laying out the scenario that Sharon was killed when Mark flew into a jealous rage. Prosecutor John Milford QC suggested that the instigating factor was a photograph, which featured Sharon and two relatives, alongside a fourth individual who had been cut out of the image. On the 16th of September, Mark would retrieve a reprint of this image from a Photoshop, and in doing so discovered that the missing individual had been Sharon's former boyfriend. Given her insistence that he discard his treasured correspondences, Mark was angered that Sharon had retained the photo, even though she had cut out her ex. Returning home, he confronted Sharon, and in the ensuing argument she headed upstairs to pack her things, adamant she was going to leave him and move back to Wakefield. At which point Robinson flew into a violent rage, which resulted in Sharon's death. The defence would, however, put forth the allegation that although Sharon had died at the hands of Robinson, he had acted due to provocation, with him taking to the stand to present his version of events. In testimony, mirroring that which he had told the police, Robinson made no mention of the photograph. Instead, fighting back tears, he claimed that the issue regarding Sharon's desire to move back to Wakefield came to the surface again on Friday the 15th of September 1989. She had told him, "I love you, I worship you, but I don't want to live in Billingham." He went on to allege that despite his reservations about leaving his £200 a week job, he agreed to move, as he wanted to show he was committed to the relationship. Yet the following morning, when he decided to voice the reasons he was reluctant to move, Mark stated that Sharon, quote, went mad, but he admitted that he couldn't blame her for her reaction, with him going on to claim that she proceeded to accuse him of making excuses because he didn't really want to move. He then alleged that as her anger swelled, she began to hit him and throw things at him, with the confrontation continuing as they headed upstairs into the master bedroom, where she persisted to throw items at him. Mark recalled that Sharon then stated, "If I can't have you, no one else can have you. I am putting you back inside." Recounting what happened next, Mark told the court, "I hit her. I don't know why, and I don't know how. I can't remember going downstairs to the drawer. All the hurt I had caused was going through my head." The court would also hear that having killed Sharon, Robinson fell into despair. Not wishing to live any more, he set about writing a note to his parents in which he lamented, quote, "I have been nothing. I never was or will be. Shaz wanted to leave me, but I could not live that way. Saying I love you is weak, but I do and always have." He then called his brother, but his sister-in-law answered the phone instead, with her being so concerned by his demeanour that she headed to the house on Bedford Terrace, where he refused to let her go upstairs. Instead, Robinson attempted to put her at ease by assuring her that both he and Sharon would come to her home later that day. Yet the visit would not take place, and having heard of his brother's unnerving behaviour, Mark's sibling headed to Bedford Terrace after finishing work at 7 p.m. Upon arrival, he headed upstairs to the master bedroom, where he discovered the body of Sharon, as well as his brother, who, having cut open his arms and legs using a 7-inch knife, had wrapped himself up in a quilt on the bed. Still conscious but weak, Mark asked his brother to fetch him another knife so he could end his life, but instead the emergency services were called. With Robinson admitting that he had killed Sharon, the onus would be on the jury to determine whether the killing had been due to an act of provocation, for which Robinson could be found guilty of manslaughter, or had he committed murder. Two pieces of evidence would prove crucial in helping them determine their verdict, the first being provided by Home Office pathologist Dr. Harvey McTaggart, who gave a detailed account of the injuries inflicted upon Sharon. She had injuries consistent with Robinson's claim that he had hit her 2 or 3 times with his fist. The force of these blows had caused a fractured jaw and a bleed to the brain. The defendant had also admitted to stabbing his girlfriend with a 10-inch knife he had retrieved from the drawer in the kitchen, but he could not be certain how many times he had stabbed her. The pathologist would answer this uncertainty by detailing that there were a total of 5 wounds, 3 of which had been inflicted with such force that they had passed through the body, cutting through the carpet beneath, and penetrating the floorboards. The other 2 knife wounds were shallower but proved to be the most fatal, as they had pierced the 25-year-old's heart. These injuries suggested Sharon had been subjected to a frenzied and violent attack. Alongside accounts of Sharon's injuries was the disclosure of Mark's prior convictions, details of which her family had only learned after her death. In court he testified that he had murdered Patricia Wagner in 1979, for which he served a 10-year prison sentence. He would go on to state that he understood and accepted that whatever their verdict, he likely faced a term of between 20 to 25 years, but his only concern was the impact his actions had on his parents and Sharon's loved ones. If he hoped his sobbing in the witness box, admittance of guilt and seeming understanding of the effects of his actions would sway the jury, he would be disappointed when they returned from deliberation to find him guilty of murder. Passing sentence, Mr. Justice Waite reminded Robinson that he had been shown a level of trust and compassion when the decision was made to release him after 10 years following Patricia Wagner's murder, with his actions betraying those who had faith that he was deserving of a second chance. Handing Mark Robinson a life term, Justice Waite proceeded to assure the convicted man that he shouldn't lose hope and that he may one day prove to no longer present a danger to society. However, the judge predicted that was likely to be, quote, many, many years from now. One person who voiced their opinion that Robinson should never be freed was Colin Morley, Sharon's father, who told the waiting press, "I hope they never let him out. We accepted him when Sharon fell in love with him. He has killed her and left us devastated." Any hopes Robinson had of release, even in the distant future, were dashed when the Home Secretary stepped in to issue a whole life tariff, meaning like many other inmates he would encounter in Wakefield Prison, he would never be released, unless there are, quote, exceptional, compassionate circumstances. Now behind bars for the rest of his life, Robinson would enter the prison system, and in 2005, just 2 days after arriving at Long Larton Prison in Worcestershire, the 2 times convicted murderer would attack wing officer David Scott. It was alleged that there had been a disagreement between the pair regarding bins in the kitchen, where Robinson had been assigned as a cleaner. As David and Robinson approached a set of wheelie bins in the yard, the latter struck the guard once, with it being stated that the impact, quote, caused a loud thud on contact. David Scott was rendered unconscious in the assault, and when taken to hospital, it was discovered he had a fractured cheekbone, a cut above the eye which required stitches, and various bruises consistent with David falling to the floor. For this attack, he was charged and convicted of causing grievous bodily harm, earning Robinson 8 years on a sentence which already meant he would never be freed. In 2011, just 6 years after this conviction, Robinson would once again demonstrate why he posed a danger to society. In December that year, Robinson, alongside a number of other prisoners, had become unsettled by staff changes at Wakefield Prison, with new, unfamiliar faces walking the wings, bringing disruption to the routines that many of the long-term inmates had become accustomed to. Alongside the changes in staff came new restrictions regarding food, with a quarter of bread being issued changed from inmates receiving 2 loaves a week to them being supplied a maximum of 3 slices a day, with these having to be stored in plastic containers to ensure they didn't go stale. Robinson was particularly aggrieved by this change, and voiced his opinion while under escort back to his cell in the prison's close supervision unit. As he walked alongside an officer, he stated, "I'm not happy with the bread situation, boss," to which the guard offered to provide him with a written explanation of why the changes had been made. Robinson replied to his suggestion by repeating his displeasure, before threatening that he, quote, "might kick off." No sooner had the words left his mouth, Robinson threw his food tray into the air and launched an attack on the guard, kicking the man in the groin with such force that his victim was raised off the ground. At 6 foot tall and 20 stone, Robinson's sheer size posed an immense challenge for the other guards who raced to their colleague's aid. Amongst them was Craig Dudley, who, as he got close enough, was struck in the face by Robinson's fist. The impact caused extensive damage to Craig's nose, resulting in him having to undergo surgery to reset the bones and remove cartilage which were affecting his breathing. Craig would not be the only guard to be hospitalised, with it taking 10 officers to get Robinson under control, of which 5 of them sustained injuries requiring medical attention. Robinson was brought up on charges of assault and affray, but the trial was delayed due to the extensive medical care Craig Dudley had to receive. However, in 2014, proceedings against Robinson would commence, much to the bewilderment of some, who questioned why a man who will never be freed from prison should be tried for another offence, when it will have no impact on his sentence. In response to this, the judge stated, "We live under the rule of law in this country, and such crimes will be prosecuted." However, in what may be perceived as an act of defiance against the justice system, 52-year-old Mark Robinson, who was due to appear via video link for his sentencing, refused to leave his cell. This did not prevent him from being handed a 3-year sentence. Although this currently is the last reported incident that I could find regarding Mark Robinson, it is unlikely he will ever be freed given his whole life tariff, and many would argue that he was already given a chance to prove he had been reformed following his release in 1989, with his actions in 2005 and 2011 only serving as support for such assertions. And while he faces being behind bars for the rest of his life, one must also consider the sentence his actions have inflicted on Sharon Morley and Patricia Wagner and their loved ones, as well as his own family, who gave Mark a loving and stable upbringing, with his enlisting in the RAF a source of great pride, only for him to throw it all away. We should also pay tribute to the prison guards who interact with him daily, particularly David Scott and Craig Dudley, whose lives have also been marked by the actions of Mark Robinson. Thank you for joining me for this episode of It's Murder Up North. Join me next time as I continue my series on the infamous inmates of Monster Mansion.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.